Welcome to Chapter 20, Population Ecology. Your book focuses pretty heavily on this chapter on talking about the wolves and moose populations on Isle Royale. So we'll go through it and use that as an example. And by the end of this lecture, you should know what the definition of ecology is, be able to understand and explain the different patterns of population growth, and understand the factors that influence population growth and population size. Okay, so what is ecology? Ecology is basically the study of the interaction of organisms within their environment. Okay, so we're looking at how organisms interact with their environment and how they interact with each other as well. So we have to be able to understand biotic and abiotic factors that influence the distribution and abundance of living things. So remember, biotic means living and abiotic is non-living. Okay. So this would be things like temperature or natural disasters, anything like that that's non-living but can still affect the ecosystem or the community, which we'll get into what those are in just a second. Okay, so if we're looking at an entire environment, we have a population A over here, all of these red smiley faces, and then we have another population over here, these blue stars, that's population B. Those are each separately a population. So this is made up of one species, right? They're all the same. They're a small population or possibly a large population, but that's a population. These two populations here make up a community. Okay. So a community is one or is more than two populations interacting with each other in some space, basically. And then the communities, which includes the populations, as well as their surrounding environment, both abiotic and biotic things, make up the whole ecosystem. Okay, so the ecosystem is here, and that's basically everything. It includes everything living and non-living and how organisms interact with each other and with their environment. So specifically when we're talking about population ecology, which is what your chapter really focuses on, it's a multidisciplinary science, which means that lots of different things go into it, right? So we're looking at biology, we're looking at geography, meteorology, mathematics, all sorts of different things. It actually has a pretty heavy focus on mathematics, which I know some of you are not big fans of, but mathematics comes into play pretty heavily in population ecology, and we end up doing a lot of what are called models to be able to understand what the distribution is and what the population actually looks like for that population, because it's not always practical to necessarily count every single individual in a population or in a community, so you have to essentially model it sometimes. So again, with population ecology, we look pretty often at the distribution pattern, and that's just the way that these individuals or organisms are distributed in a geographic space. So it depends pretty heavily on the resources and the interactions with other members of the population, right? If they are being thrown out of some area because there's a high density of predators, or if there's not enough food for them, then they're going to change the way they're distributed based on that. And distribution patterns oftentimes really reflect behavioral or ecological adaptations. Okay, so you can see here, again, we're focusing on Isle Royale. We've got some wolves here surrounding this big moose here in the middle. And you can see, I think there's at least 4 wolves there. There might be more that are out of frame as well. But our wolves tend to pack together, whereas moose tend to be pretty solitary. So when we're looking at these guys, they obviously have really different lifestyles, and they distribute very differently on Isle Royale and in other places as well. So we can determine the size of each population, but they require different strategies. So when we're looking at individual wolves, they're actually easier to find because they cluster together in these packs. So it's really easy to spot them and track them and count them. Moose, however, are pretty much solitary, and they're distributed arguably randomly throughout the island. So counting them requires a little bit of a different strategy. So you see here down at the bottom, they've got an aerial view of a plot. So they basically make different plots on this map of the area, and then they go through and they count. They basically sample and count in different plots and then multiply that by something else in order to get an estimate of what the population is. So It's a little bit easier to identify the wolves just because they're easier to spot and track with so many of them, but the moose, they have to do this special aerial survey so that they can kind of understand how many there are. Okay, so there's 3 different distribution patterns that we're going to talk about. One of them is random, and this allows individuals to maximize their access to resources. So there's no really rhyme or reason they're going to be at the place that allows them to have the most resources and be the most successful. So you might have some that are really close together, they might be really far apart. It's truly random. And this is honestly something that's pretty difficult to find in nature, because even though we say it's random, true randomness is hard to find. Because let's say an example would be like pine trees, right? So for pine trees to be able to disperse their seed, wind has to blow it essentially, and then their seed gets dispersed somewhere. And that is random. However, that seed is not going to actually grow and become a tree unless that seed happens to fall in a place with fertile soil. So it is random, but it's not totally random, because we know that there's places that it can and can't occur. So it doesn't make it truly random. So this is hard to find in nature. But so like the pine trees are an example, moose are also an example. They are fairly randomly distributed, and again, they're usually solitary. Random distribution doesn't always have to be solitary organisms, but it often is. Another distribution pattern is clumped distribution, and this is something we see in, say, something like a school of fish or even in wolves. And oftentimes this is as a result of social behavior that dictates grouping. It can also be because resources are unevenly distributed across the landscape. So in the case of fish up here, we have our fish and they're schooling together. Why do fish school together? Usually it's as a mechanism to avoid predation, essentially, right? It's a defense mechanism. So if you're basically, it's like if you're in a big group, it's a lot harder to get you versus maybe some of the other fish or some of the other fish that might be on the outside of the group, whatever it might be. But in fish, this is a defense mechanism. When we look at it for wolves, it can also be a defense mechanism, but when wolves hunt in a pack, that's actually the advantage, because you think about them hunting something like, say, a moose is much, much larger than an individual wolf. So one wolf really would have a difficult time taking down a moose, depending on how healthy that moose was. But a whole pack of them can take down a moose a little bit more efficiently. So they actually group together as a social behavior to hunt, and it's an advantage to their predatory style. The last one is uniform distribution, and this is usually because of territorial behavior. So the best examples are usually nesting birds. So for example, penguins over here, and they're usually pretty uniformly distributed. So you can tell right here, it's a little bit different than the random pattern, right? You can kind of tell like, okay, they're always going to be at least 8 feet apart, or, you know, whatever it might be. And that's as a result of some sort of territorial behavior. And you see it a lot with nesting, especially in birds. Okay, so when we're talking about population growth, how do we know if a population is growing? And this holds true for even humans, right? So if we want to know if a population is growing, we have to look at the growth rate. The way we get the growth rate is we take the birth rate and subtract the death rate, right? So this is influenced by a lot of different things. And basically you have a positive growth rate, or your population is growing, if your birth rate is higher than your death rate. But if your death rate is higher than your birth rate, then your population is actually decreasing and it's not growing at all, right? Because you have more individuals dying than you do being born. So this is influenced by a few different things. One of them is immigration, which is the movement of individuals into a population, right? And the next one is emigration, which is movement of individuals out of a population. Okay, so growth rate is influenced by those things, as well as actual birth and death rate, obviously, as well. So there's a few different types of population growth, or really 2 that we're going to talk about. The first one is exponential growth. Okay, exponential growth is unrestricted growth of a population increasing at a constant growth rate. So it just basically goes up and up and up. And I think the example your book uses is like a credit card with interest, right? So if you, let's say, make a $20 payment, and you let it sit on your credit card, and then all of a sudden you have interest added to it. Let's say you have an 18% interest rate. then now you're not only paying that $20, you're paying that 18% interest rate, right? And the more months go on and on and on, the more it keeps growing. It doesn't go up just by 18% each time. It goes up by 18% of what you owe plus that 18%. So it just keeps growing exponentially, and it's unrestricted growth. So this is something that's not true in nature. There's always something that stops population from growing indefinitely like this. Right, so exponential growth can happen for a certain period of time, but after some time, really, it's not really possible. The other one we have is logistic growth. So it starts off looking pretty close to exponential growth. It starts off really fast, and then it actually levels off. So we have different environmental factors that limit an organism's ability to reproduce. So again, it starts off really fast here, and then once it gets up to this area here, this is probably the straightest line I've ever drawn. Once it gets up here, this is what we call the carrying capacity. Okay. Once it hits a carrying capacity, it means that there are not enough resources to sustain that growth, which is why normally we hit some sort of logistic growth instead of exponential, because there's always going to be some limiting factor. There can't just be exponential growth for an indefinite amount of time. So with this carrying capacity, it's essentially the max number of individuals that an environment can support given its space and resources. Okay, so again, we start off logistic growth and then we level off here. But we don't level off nice and pretty like that. We actually kind of go up and down a little bit. Okay, so the carrying capacity here, that's the upper limit on the size of any population. So for any population, we have that, as well as the human population, right? We've been growing, not totally exponentially, but we've been growing pretty quickly, especially in recent decades. And we're probably going to hit some sort of carrying capacity where our resources really can't keep us going. And we've probably already hit it, but with the advancement of technology and everything, we've been able to sort of sustain this. But again, upper limit on any size of a population, but it doesn't just perfectly level off, right? Sometimes you go up and you do what's called overshoot the carrying capacity, and then it'll go back down, right? And then once it comes back down here, now all of a sudden we have more resources than we need for our population, so we go back up. So this is what's called boom and bust. Okay, so this is boom and bust right here, and that's essentially just going above and below the carrying capacity because of resources and sort of overshooting and then undershooting. Okay, so again, we have exponential growth, which is something that can happen for some amount of time, but the definition is it's indefinitely. So it's not as true in nature as something like logistic growth. And again, we get up here and we start going boom and bust right around the carrying capacity, depending on whether we overshoot it or undershoot. Okay. So again, this is the boom and bust part. So we have a size of a population that may fluctuate right around the environment's carrying capacity, and this could be due to disease or food shortage, which might cause the population to shrink. Also allows the environment time to recover its food supply. So once it does overshoot, once it goes into that undershoot, right, this is when we're kind of in a recovery time. And then once it recovers, then we can kind of go back up. And, sometimes it goes all the way up here. Sometimes it just barely goes over until it needs to recover. It depends on the environment and what's happening. Okay. But population may begin to grow again, which is up here, or it might level off. It just depends, again, on what species you're looking at, what population, what the ecosystem looks like as a whole. Okay, and referred to as boom and bust, so make sure you know that. So when we're looking at population growth, the cool thing about Isle Royale is that it's this isolated island up in, I think it's Lake Superior, and really the only way that animals can get to or from is if it becomes so cold that an ice bridge forms. And that's how wolves eventually got to this island, because before it was just moose, and they were essentially taking over the island and showing almost exponential growth. But they logistically did kind of reach a carrying capacity because moose eat mostly trees, and these trees Obviously, the more moose you have and the more moose that are eating trees, the worse the trees are doing. So you can follow the tree growth rate and how many trees there are. You can kind of follow also the moose and wolf populations. But here we're looking at wolves and we're looking at moose. So moose numbers are over here on the right, wolves are over here on the left, and wolves are in the red. So you can see as the wolves dip down here, we see our moose population going up, right? But then as they start to go up, there's more food for the wolves, so then the wolf population also starts to go up. So wolf population starts to go up, but as it starts getting higher, you have more wolves, you have them eating more moose. Now all of a sudden the moose population is going to go down as well because more of them are dying off than are being born. That's our growth rate, right? So if our moose population drops and it pretty much tanks, the wolf population is going to do the exact same thing because now they're dying essentially of starvation because they don't have enough resources to support a growing population. So you can see that this correlates pretty well with each other, and you can kind of tell where they're going to peak and pit based on each other's population sizes. So anything that affects the size of one population could affect the size of other population in the ecosystem as well. So this is something that we see really, really well on Isle Royale, and that's what makes it a really good study site and something that ecologists and population ecologists have been really interested in over the years. So again, because we can track the moose and the wolves, we can also track tree growth, right? So the way we measure tree growth is you measure the width of each tree ring. So one ring represents 1 year, right? So if I have here, this is how much that tree grew in 1 year. So if it's wider, that means it grew more. That's not a good job of being narrower, but narrower here, so we know that the tree did not grow as much. So if it's wider, that means more growth in that year, which probably means that you had less moose, right? So you can see here, wolf population goes down, which means that the moose population goes up. And when the moose population goes up, our tree population probably ultimately decreases, but even more importantly, we have slower tree growth because they are just gnawing on all of these trees. So you can even track things like tree growth or plant density to be able to see how these two different populations are tracking together. So ecologists can use a bunch of different data sources to sort of monitor the health of populations, right? And you'll see this with both the wolves and the moose, but they can use moose scat. So their feces that they're leaving behind, they know then what kind of vegetation preferences the moose population has by looking at moose scat, which tells them something really important because ideally they normally are only eating one or two different kinds of trees or shrubs. So if they see that maybe they're eating some different type of vegetation during periods of really high growth rate or really low, maybe that kind of gives a good indication of they're able to adapt to different sorts of vegetation preferences. Wolf scat they can look at as a source of DNA, so it provides a really good genetic profile for each wolf on the island. And this is especially important now because there are not many wolves. So wolves came over on this ice bridge, I don't remember when, but only 2 wolves came over, right? So all of these wolves are pretty genetically similar. And now there are so few that being able to look at the DNA is really important because they only have, say, like 14 wolves on the island. So you want to be able to actually understand which ones are which so that you know if you have a higher population or not. Because even though you only have 14 wolves on an island, it's still difficult to be able to count those guys because they're not just sitting still, right? They're moving and they're in different packs. The other thing you can look at is moose bones, and this provides really good information on whether they have arthritis or osteoporosis, bone marrow fat content. So it gives you a really good idea of what their nutritional health looked like when they died. So obviously moose are really large and they are really difficult to take down, which is why wolves are hunting in packs, but the wolves are usually also going for the older moose that are kind of in low nutritional health, or sometimes the younger moose that are also, maybe not doing so great, but they're also a lot smaller. They can also use urine-soaked snow, and they can determine the ratio of urea and creatinine in the urine, and that's an indication of a moose's nutritional status as well. So they can use both bones and the snow for that, and they can obviously get DNA from the bones as well, but scat is a pretty good source of DNA for both of these guys, really. So overall, scat, bones, urine-soaked snow, as well as DNA, all of these can be used to monitor the health of these wild animals. So again, with Isle Royale, there's a number of factors that influence the likelihood that wolves will kill moose. One of them is something called population density. So population density is basically the number of organisms per given area. Okay? So the more organisms you have, the higher the population density is. So say if we're looking at New York versus Honolulu, right? The population density is much higher in New York than is in Honolulu. There's a lot more people living in a smaller area than there is here, or even let's say somewhere like Wisconsin, right, where you're in like more country type area. But we have both density dependent and density independent factors. So density dependent factors means that it's a factor that's influence on the population size and growth depends on the number and crowding of individuals in the population. Okay, so this is dependent, right? It depends on the number of individuals in that population. Examples are down here in the green. So density dependent would be something like predators, right? So the presence of wolf predators limits your moose population growth, especially when moose density is high. So when you've got a really high population density of moose, you're also going to, again, start seeing an increase in wolf populations because they have more food to eat, essentially. So that high population density is basically going to increase predation. Food is also density dependent, right? So the availability of trees as food definitely influences moose population growth, especially when moose density is high. Moose density is high means that there's lots of moose, means that there's not as much food. Disease is also a big one, and we see this kind of like with coronavirus right now, right? So you see in really high density areas like say New York, this disease is really rapid and it's everywhere, versus somewhere like in the country that you're not seeing as many cases, or you're not seeing it spread as much. And it's the same thing here. If you have a really high density somewhere, then something like disease, which is density dependent, it just weakens that population. So a big part of disease with these mooses on Isle Royale is tick infestations, and they really kind of weaken the moose. They limit their reproduction. They cause them to lose a lot of their hair, which doesn't allow them to be very successful in the winter. So it also kind of takes away their appetite, which also again does not allow them to be very successful in the winter. We also have our density independent factors, right? So these are the ones that can influence your population size and growth regardless of numbers and crowding within a population. So examples up here in the blue. So this is usually our abiotic factors, right? So something like fire or any sort of natural disaster, and it's immediate danger to that population, and it can destroy their habitat. It can make the food really scarce. It could kill off the individuals in the population anyways. That's density independent. It doesn't matter if you have a high density or a low density, it's going to affect that population, right? So these are, again, abiotic. So something like precipitation or temperature. Higher temperatures can cause heat stress in moose and increase insect parasitism, so it helps those ticks really thrive. Things like that. These are density independent factors that are going to make a difference whether or not you have a high or low density. Yeah. Other factors that limit population size or can affect it, again, disease. A lot of the wolves were killed off by something called CPV, or canine parvovirus. Climate change is also a big one. So there's a few different reasons climate change is affecting them so much. One is the warmer it gets, these ticks do better, right? So if the ticks are doing better and they're able to really infest more moose, then it's eventually going to be killing off these moose. So this is an example of a moose over here, and you can see that its hair is kind of scattered, it's missing big clumps of hair, and that's because it has these ticks, and these ticks are much more prevalent the warmer it gets, and they do a lot better the warmer it gets. So climate change is really affecting that. It's also affecting the ability to build an ice bridge over winter times, because that really hasn't been happening. No new wolves have been able to cross over and come to Isle Royale, so we haven't been seeing an influx of those guys either. Climate change can also affect food sources, right, as well as trees and stuff like that. So again, less eating in warm weather, so they're not doing as well in the winter months because they don't have as much insulation, which is also affected because the warm weather is favoring the ticks, so it's causing them to kind of rip out their hair and everything. Okay, so it has become kind of a significant influence on their populations as of recently. And again, you can kind of track it by looking at something like ticks. So as ticks start to increase, our moose are decreasing, and our wolves were doing kind of well, but now they're coming back down because we don't have any moose for them to eat, right? And again, we were talking about DNA and looking at wolves and how few there are, and it's important to know which wolves you're looking at so that you can identify any new individuals, so you know the actual population size. And a big part of the problem that they're going to be experiencing is extreme inbreeding, because they're all so closely related at this point, and there's so few of them. So there's probably going to be lots of different mutations and diseases that will be more prevalent in these wolves than ever before. And I think a few years ago, I think this is 2015, they thought they spotted a new pair, and then they, I think they probably got wolf scat and realized that they weren't actually a new pair. They were ones that they'd already known existed before. And so because of this, the wolf population is really, really low right now, which means the moose population is up. And I need to kind of look into this again to see where it's at. But in 2014, National Park Service voted no to bringing in new wolves. This is always a big question for conservation biologists, right? Do you mess with nature? So even though we are arguably affecting climate change a little bit, we're not directly involved in Isle Royale, right? We're not there. It's not very heavily populated by humans. I think humans go every now and then to, hike around or do different sorts of nature activities, but it's not super affected by humans in that sense. So it's always the question of whether you intervene or not, because say they do put more wolves in, that could cause the moose population to decline and possibly go extinct over time. And then the wolves would also probably go extinct over time because they wouldn't have any food source. Or, you leave it and you let them go and they continue this inbreeding and they don't maybe have a lot of availability to mate with one another, and then the wolves go extinct. So it's always a question for conservation biologists, which one is better. So 2014 they said no. 2016 they decided to actually bring in 20 to 30 wolves over the next few years. They would slowly phase them in. And I think as of maybe a few months ago when I looked into this, there's only about 15 in the park now, which is not very many. But I think they still have some plans to phase in a few of the wolves, but I don't know how well that's being received or if it's being executed the right way. But there have been programs like this that have been really successful, and there have also been programs like this that have caused lots of harm. So it really requires quite a bit of research on the population ecologist end, as well as other things too, and making sure that you're not introducing things like invasive species.